so much, Faye, and thanks, Malika and Alexandra, for organizing this conference. As Faye mentioned, I'm going to speak a bit about the history and future of psilocybin. In general, my approach to this particular topic is just saying no. That's KNOW. And so hopefully a few of the things that I share will help assist those of you considering embarking upon a journey, or for those of you who have already some experience, it fills out the picture of where these magic mushrooms came from. So before getting into the history of human use of psilocybin, I thought we should start with natural history. It's important to note the evolutionary history that makes tripping possible. You may wonder why so many plants and fungi produce chemicals that mimic endogenous neurotransmitters in human nervous systems. That is, why are there so many chemicals in plants and fungi that fit right into the receptors in our brain that are intimately related to our consciousness? Well, you may have heard of this thing called evolution. We all share a common ancestor on this planet going back about 4 billion years. The last common ancestor of eukaryotes, cells with a nucleus, is about 1 billion years old. Plants, fungi, including mushrooms and insects, have been co-evolving for about 400 million years. And I want to bring your attention to some fantastic research done by David O. Kennedy in this book, Plants and the Human Brain, where he traces the evolution of the metabolic pathways that allow for human consciousness to be altered by these plant and fungal chemicals. So in addition to what are called the primary metabolites in plants and fungi, that help these organisms sustain their own basic life processes, there are also what are called secondary metabolites, and there's a huge variety of them. These secondary metabolites include things like terpenes, which give some of our favorite flowers the wonderful aromas that they have. They also include other alkaloids. And these secondary metabolites are known to have ecological functions, which is to say that they allow plants to communicate with one another and with other species, including insects and larger animals. Now, the psilocybe genus has been around for, it's estimated, about 10 to 20 million years. And even before that, though, the insect nervous system was co-evolving not only with fungi, but with plants and flowers in particular. And the metabolic pathways that allow for the amino acid L-tryptophan to be synthesized into serotonin were established by insects. And so our ability as human beings to ingest mushrooms and be altered by the psilocybin that they contain is really an evolutionary achievement of plants, insects, and their coevolution. So as Kennedy puts it, humans have an elaborated version of the insect nervous system. We're intimately related to these other creatures. And in this sense, I think we have to come to see the human nervous system, the human brain, as not simply contained inside of our skull. It extends out into the surrounding ecosystem, not only spatially, but also temporally into the depths of evolutionary time. So there's a much longer story here than just human history. So I wanted to start with this slide on the natural history and the coevolution of plants, animals, and fungi, so that you get a sense for how deep this relationship goes. So then moving to the cultural prehistory, as many of you probably know, there is a rich history of shamanic use of psilocybe mushrooms. Our hominin ancestors, going back millions of years, have almost certainly been ingesting psilocybe mushrooms. Hard evidence that would allow us to determine exactly how these mushrooms affected their cultural life and Their religious practices is a bit harder to come by, but there's no question that across every continent, human beings have been ingesting psychoactive plants and fungi, including psilocybe mushrooms, often in religious and spiritual contexts, but not just in those contexts, as we'll see. I want to express a word of caution at this point, just to be careful not to project our modern and postmodern biases back in time. As Andy Letcher, the author of this wonderful book, which I highly recommend, Shroom, A Cultural History of the Magic Mushroom, as he says in this book, and I quote, "The tendency to imagine drugs at the center of a variety of ancient religions says rather more about us and our inability to countenance religious ecstasy without the use of psychoactives than it does about the religions concerned." So I invite you to consider that human consciousness has not always existed in the form it does today. It has metamorphosed over time. Indeed, it has evolved. There has been an evolution of consciousness. And our present day disenchanted, more or less rational, individualistic mode of consciousness is a rather recent invention. It may seem hard for us to imagine the ability to see or hear gods in our current state of consciousness without being very high. But this may not have been the case for our more animistic ancestors who had a very different mode of perception of the surrounding world. You see here in the slide a reproduction, a drawing of a piece of cave art in the Sahara Desert. It's actually drawn by Kat Harrison, who was married to Terence McKenna. And then below that on the right is another cave drawing from this same area. There's evidence of psychoactive mushroom use, as I mentioned, in ancient Egypt and Siberia, Spain, Greece, China, Australia, and the Americas, basically every inhabited continent, going back at least to about 9,000 BCE. So now moving on to the colonial history. The conquistador Hernan Cortez arrived in present-day Mexico in 1519. He had been in Cuba first. He was, along with other conquistadors, intent on conquering the local population. The Aztec Empire was reigning at the time. He was in search of gold, of course, and he had a few hundred men on his ships and some cannons, but his main weapon, his most powerful weapon, was microscopic. At the time, it was a secret even to himself. I'm talking about smallpox. When Europeans landed in the Americas, waves of disease swept inland faster than the conquistadors themselves could move in. And so by the time Cortez reached the Aztec city, Tenochtitlan, almost certainly not pronouncing that correctly, but by the time he got there, the population had been devastated by smallpox. And really, this is the only reason that the outnumbered Spanish were able to prevail. But these conquistadors didn't only bring disease and war, they also brought some friars who served as the first European anthropologists studying the cultures of the Americas. This is Bernardino de Sahagún. He was a Franciscan friar, another well-known friar who chronicled the cultural practices of the indigenous populations. Was Diego Duran. He was a Dominican friar. We have the earliest European reports of the use of psilocybin from these figures. Sahagún wrote a book translated as The Universal History of the Things of New Spain. This book is a picture book. He drew various depictions of the use of these mushrooms, which the Aztecs called Tiyonanacatl, which means flesh of the gods. I want to read to you one of Sahagún's reports. He remarks that The Aztec ruler at the time, Moctezuma II, would employ a group of mushroom munching priests to make prophecies about his battles. He also reports uh, recreational use as well as religious uses of the flesh of the gods. So it wasn't just a religious context in which they were used. Often the elites would have these sort of what we might call dinner parties, and they would eat mushrooms and dance and enjoy themselves. Sahagun has this to say in the Universal History of the Things of New Spain. I quote, "These are intoxicating, these mushrooms, and they cause visions to be seen and even provoke sensuousness. They ate these mushrooms before dawn, and they also drank chocolate before daylight. They ate these little mushrooms with honey, and when they began to be excited by them, they began to dance, some singing, others weeping. When the intoxication from the little mushrooms had passed, they talked over among themselves the visions which they had seen." And so this would have been in about the early 1500s that he was writing this report. Some of you may recognize some of these practices as being revitalized in our time now. As colonization progressed, the Catholic imposition of a European worldview onto the local populations went about eradicating these practices. From the Catholic point of view, it seemed a bit like demonic possession resulted from eating these mushrooms, and so they wanted to get rid of it and convert everyone to Christianity. So colonization progressed. These practices were pushed into the more remote areas in the Mesoamerican mountains, where a few lineages survived. It wasn't until the early 20th century that Europeans rediscovered some of these lineages, beginning with the American botanist William Safford in the first decade or two of the 20th century, who argued in the scientific journals of the time that Teonanacatl was really a peyote cactus, that in fact Sahagun, who identified it with the mushroom, was wrong. The Austrian botanist who was living in Oaxaca at the time, Blas Pablo Reco, and his cousin Victor, they challenged Safford's identification of Teonanacatl with peyote in a 1919 paper in a Mexican journal. They said, no, Sahagun was right. It was a mushroom, and this practice is still alive. And then finally, in 1936, after receiving some samples of mushrooms that were sent to Harvard by the linguist Robert Whitelander, who was living in Oaxaca, these mushrooms couldn't be identified. They were too decomposed, but this fellow, Richard Schultz, was intrigued enough to journey down to Oaxaca to investigate himself, and he wrote this paper in 1939 that argues that no, it was mushrooms. Sahagun was right, but Schultz in this paper wrongly identifies the species of mushroom as Panaeolus camphanolatus, which turns out not to be psychoactive. This wasn't discovered to be an incorrect identification for another almost 20 years. It was this fellow, Gordon Wasson, who was a former journalist turned banking executive, and his wife, Valeria, who would journey back down to Central America, to Oaxaca, once they had learned from Schultz about the existence of these the mushroom and the practices surrounding them. Now, Wasson believed that all human religion originated in a primeval mushroom cult, and so he was very interested in having this experience for himself. And so in the summer of 1955, under the guidance of this woman, Maria Sabina, Gordon Wasson and his wife and a few others, including a photographer, ate mushrooms. They tried psilocybin mushrooms, and they were beyond impressed with its profound effects. Now, Wasson would go on a few years later to publish his findings in Life magazine. The editors of this magazine were the first to coin the term magic mushrooms. Wasson also sent some samples of psilocybin mushrooms from Oaxaca to the mycologist Roger Heim, who was in Paris at the time, and Heim identified the samples that Wasson sent as the genus psilocybe. Wasson had also sent morning glory seeds and salvia, which were also first identified by Western science at that time. The famous chemist Albert Hofmann, who decades earlier had synthesized LSD for the first time, was asked by Roger Heim if he could isolate the active ingredient in these psilocybe mushrooms. So Hoffman cultivated some mushrooms in his lab, and he and his assistants, testing the substances on themselves, eventually isolated the compounds psilocybin and psilocine from the samples that Heim sent him. And Sandoz, the pharmaceutical company that Hoffman worked for, began synthesizing and marketing psilocybin under the name indocybin. And Wasson would eventually bring some of these pills to Sabina, who confirmed that indeed the magic was in them. Now, though he was clearly seeking fame and academic credit, Wasson never intended to disrupt Maria Sabina's life as much as would end up happening. But by publishing the location of her town, he opened the door to thousands, tens of thousands of God seeking hippies to travel to Mexico seeking enlightenment. This led the locals in her town in the Oaxaca mountains to ostracize Sabina. Her home was burned down at one point. And so we can see in the 20th century, after the horrible results of colonization beginning in the 16th century, that colonization, in fact, continued into the 20th century. Now, Wasson's article was read by many people in the United States and around the world. One of the people who read his article was a psychology professor at Harvard. You may have heard of him, Timothy Leary. So, obviously, being quite interested in what Wasson was reporting, he traveled to Mexico to try them with a different shaman, not Maria Sabina, and obviously had a powerful experience. He didn't realize that Sandoz had already synthesized the active ingredient, and upon returning from Mexico, he wrote to Sandoz and asked for his own supply, at which point he founded the infamous Harvard psilocybin project with these other two gentlemen in the photograph here. That's Richard Alpert on the left and Ralph Metzner on the right, who was their graduate student at the time. And so they used Sandoz's indocybin, as it was called, or psilocybin, to conduct experiments, many of which are of questionable scientific validity. They thought that the sort of quantitative controlled methods of science inhibited the transformative effect that these substances could have. But nonetheless, they did some early research to see how psilocybin could transform human psychology. One of the most famous experiments, oops, sorry about that, that they did was called the Marsh Chapel experiment at Marsh Chapel in Boston. It was done by one of their students, Walter Pankey. He was in the medical program at Harvard as well as the divinity school. And he designed an experiment double-blind experiment to give psilocybin to divinity students, among whom was Houston Smith, the famous scholar of religion and philosopher, to see if psilocybin would heighten their experience of Sunday Mass. And so there was a group, some of whom were given a dose of niacin and others actual mushrooms, and indeed the results were impressive, even if the design was flawed. In his dissertation, when Pankey reports on the results of this experiment, he mentions how those who received psilocybin reported having mystical experiences, some of the most profound experiences in their lives. But he didn't mention that one of the divinity students who was dosed with psilocybin had a very intense experience and left the church and was running to meet with the dean of Harvard to explain to him that he was the Messiah and that he had a message for humanity. And he was obviously having a very powerful experience himself, but not able to effectively interface with other people who were not tripping at the time. And he actually needed to be sedated. And so none of this was mentioned in Pankey's original report on the experiment. Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, later did a follow-up study interviewing many of the subjects in this original study about 25 years later. And many of them said that that was still one of the most powerful experiences, mystical experiences of their lives. But Doblin also had some criticisms of the method. Now, for those of you who know this history, by 1963, you'll remember that Leary and Alpert had been fired from Harvard, and that before the end of the decade, psilocybin use would be criminalized. And Richard Alpert traveled to India and came back as Ram Dass, becoming a spiritual teacher. Leary would become his own brand of psychedelic messiah. Ralph Metzner, for his part, would go on to become academic dean at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where he worked and taught for many years. So moving on to the present, or almost the present, we're in the midst of a psychedelic renaissance. Research, after many years of being pushed to the margins, research on scientific academic research on psychedelics, including psilocybin, began again in the 90s with some studies in Switzerland. And they've just been piling up ever since. These are just some of the recent papers and news reports. But of course, it's not just medical science where research on psychedelics is occurring. Philosophers like me are getting in on the action. A couple of recent books have been published on this. But of course, it all really started with the 2006 paper coming out of Johns Hopkins University. Roland Griffiths and Bill Richards and others published this paper with the title "Psilocybin Can Occasion Mystical Type Experiences Having Substantial and Sustained Personal Meaning and Spiritual Significance." So this was the watershed moment. Newspapers all over the world covered this, and it was clear that a resurgence was occurring. Psilocybin and other psychedelics were being taken seriously again in a medical context after a lot of promising research, even before the Harvard Psilocybin Project. I should have mentioned LSD and psilocybin were being studied, and psychologists and psychiatrists thought that there were many promising results. But again, when it became illegal, all that got put on hiatus for decades. So to shift now to speaking a bit about the future, what's obvious already, I would say, is that psilocybin and the other classic psychedelics need to be rescheduled. In the United States, they're Schedule I substances, which means that there is a high potential for addiction and no recognized medical use. Now, there's enough research already, I would say, to show that both of these claims are false in the case of the psychedelics. There's very little potential for addiction. In fact, many studies are showing they can help treat addiction. People with alcohol use disorder or who are addicted to nicotine and so on, psilocybin, LSD have been shown to help people get over those addictions. And obviously, there's plenty of evidence building of their medical potential. So they need to be rescheduled. I think in the case of psilocybin mushrooms, decriminalization is the most common sense approach. Why? Well, because there's no issue really with safe supply. This isn't a chemical that needs to be synthesized, like, say, MDMA or LSD. People can grow their own mushrooms, right? So decriminalization makes sense. Some of these other psychedelics, where safe supply is an issue, I think we need a slightly more complicated regulatory structure. But I think there are basically three types of application for psilocybin as we move into this new future. This is Merlin Sheldrake holding his book, Entangled Life. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I think, as he illustrates and displays in his book, there's great potential for the scientific and philosophical use of the altered states of consciousness produced by psilocybin, to allow us to explore consciousness, to solve scientific problems due to the enhanced creativity that can result from these experiences. There's also, of course, the medical. Oh, I should mention this book. It just came out, Philosophy and Psychedelics. I have a chapter in here, some other great chapters exploring the application of psychedelic experience to philosophy. There's also, of course, the medical applications, which everyone has probably heard so much about. Psychiatric treatments for individual mental health diagnoses is how I would characterize this particular application. There are several phase 3 FDA clinical trials of MDMA and psilocybin that are underway. Within the next, I would say, 3 to 5 years, these substances will likely be prescribed. I'll talk more about that in a moment. The other possible future application, of course, is the religious use. There are so many new religious movements, churches, let's say, and religious communities that are cropping up that are treating mushrooms as sacraments, as what was the case for and continues to be the case for many indigenous communities. Now, there is some concern here about appropriation, but I also think that spirituality is a universal mode of human expression, and I'm all in favor of even some Christian communities, Mormons, in fact, are shifting out of the more dogmatic form of worship in their church to explore new forms of even Christianity that integrate mushrooms as a sacrament. And so the transformative potential here, even for what are traditionally thought to be the colonizing patriarchal religions of the West, is there. And so these three different avenues for the future application of psilocybin, I think, are each very promising. I do want to say a bit about the medicalization of psychedelics as we move forward, to raise some concerns that I have. As I say in the slide here, I worry about the way that mental health issues become individualized, as though depression or addiction, anxiety, and so on are issues with our brain chemistry, simply located inside the skull of one individual, rather than having something to do with cultural and social conditions. I don't think, despite how promising some of these medical studies are, that we should conceive of psilocybin as a miracle cure. There are also psychiatrists who argue that with further research, they can refine these alkaloids such that one would not even need to have the mystical experience that correlates with the positive mental health effects in many of these studies. They're saying that experience is sort of extra epiphenomenal, not necessary for the healing effect, which is just chemical, right? So there's a kind of reductionistic philosophy underlying this, that we could just get the right chemical, people could take the pill, and be alleviated of their depression without any um, psychedelic experience. I'm very skeptical of this, but it's being argued. To close, let me share the report of one woman who was involved in a participant in one of Roland Griffith's studies at Johns Hopkins, Rachel Peterson, just to emphasize the dangers and the promise of the psilocybin magic mushroom experience. Far from masking emotional pain or preventing one from facing hard truths about themselves, it's well known that psychedelics can elicit intense and difficult experiences of self confrontation, even in the most well controlled environments. Griffiths and his team have reported that in a study on psilocybin, and many of their studies on psilocybin, while more than a third of participants did experience extreme levels of fear and paranoia at some point during their session, as Griffith says, I quote, "These psychological struggles did not affect the overall rate of having what was determined to be a complete mystical experience as rated by volunteers at the end of their session." End quote. So indeed, such difficult feelings, which colloquially are referred to as bad trips, they're often considered by participants to be an essential ingredient for generating the insight and meaning so characteristic of the psychedelic experience. So Rachel Peterson, who participated in the 2018 psilocybin study at Johns Hopkins, focusing on major depression, Peterson described her experience this way, I quote, "The many things that I experienced over those first 6 hours really defy retelling. Among them, I became one with nature, only to become one with its ongoing decimation. And I wept with a depth of grief and guilt unknown in my waking life. Wild with pain, I asked nothing in particular. What is there after this? And my experience broke open into an abiding force that permeated existence. Something, rather an ultimate nothing, that felt infinite and furiously important. A nothing that seemed to somehow exist before the trip began and felt like it endured long after the trip ended." That's Peterson. So I share this because I think it highlights the way that rather than merely neuroscientific chemicals or psychotherapeutic tools to fix the broken brain, Peterson came to understand psychedelics as what she calls ontological insurgents or agitators that can facilitate direct experiential encounters with other forms of reality, but that, as she puts it, perhaps to our horror, also demand something of us. So I share this report from Peterson just to remind us that these aren't miracle cures. The windows and the doors of perception that they open for us invite us to exercise our own will to transform ourselves and the world. They're not going to do it for us, right? They give us a new way of seeing the world, but to bring that world into existence, it's going to take a lot of effort on our part, a lot of sober work. So thank you for your attention. I think we have some time for questions now.